and destined for Cosford by road is XH672 Maid Marian. Of the remaining four, the nose section of XM717 Lucky Lou will be on display at the RAF Museum at Hendon. But for the others, like so many before them, it's fire rescue training and eventually the scrap man.
Are we on the logbook for X-Ray Hotel 672, the last of the week on this?
Thank you very much.
Please look after.
Yes, sure, sir.
And
that's the last
that's
sign.
The original copy of the authorisation sheet for the last sorting.
Yes, very pleased to have it at long last, and relieved too, because at one point in time we weren't going to get it. We did want it to arrive at Cosford, but of course the runway's too short there. But landing it here is a blessing in disguise, because it's going to be broken down and then loaded to Cosford. And while it's been dismantled, it can be sprayed. The inner workings can be sprayed, and we'll be able to keep it for a lot longer then. Not just 33 years, or 40 years since it first flew, of course, 1953, but for another 100 years, we hope.
Aircraft shapes were constantly tested in wind tunnels. British designers had learned much from German research.
During the closing years of World War II, Britain discovered that the Germans had very advanced supersonic wind tunnels, far more advanced than what we had in the UK.
In fact, this very wind tunnel in Farnborough is one captured from the Germans and brought back to Britain. Wind tunnel research helped produce a whole new generation of aircraft. The V-bombers, the Valiant, the Vulcan, and the Victor. Three very different bombers with a common destructive purpose.
The story of the V-bomber is intimately linked to the story of Britain's view of itself in the world. In the late 40s, the British, in order to remain an independent great power, they decided to embark upon creating their own nuclear weapons. If they're going to create their own nuclear weapons, they had to have a way of delivering them. So what did they do? Well, in a way, they went back to the tried and tested formula of the Second World War.
In the war, three heavy bombers, the Lancaster, Halifax and Stirling, had pulverized Germany. Now the new generation, Valiant, Vulcan and Victor, could strike a nuclear hammer blow against the Soviet Union. But why did the Air Ministry, in a seemingly extravagant move, go for three different V-bomber designs?
The ministry decided to go for three because the first aircraft, the Valiant, was quite straightforward and simple and could be produced quickly, whereas the more advanced ones, the Vulcan and Victor, were to be proceeded with until it was clear that one of them was the better aircraft. And in the end, the ministry went for all three because all three worked.
Absolutely incredible if you think about it now, the way things are and the way they were then.
It's all fantastic.
The largest, heaviest and most aerodynamically advanced of the V-bombers was the Victor. With its otherworldly crescent-shaped tail and wings, the Victor was massive. Its enormous 110 feet wingspan and distinctive cockpit gave it a predatory presence.
I think to this day, the Handley Page Victor is one of the most evil-looking aircraft I've ever seen. If you wanted the plane which looked like something out of 1950s science fiction, it was the Victor.
A bomber with an incredible range of 6,000 miles, the Victor was powered by 4 thunderous Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire engines. The pilots could call upon a mammoth 40 tons of thrust to get this monster into the air. But when it comes to making a lasting impression, there's one V-bomber head and shoulders above the rest. At the 1955 air show, Falk did what no one had ever done with a heavy bomber. He rolled the Vulcan. The crowds loved it, but Falk was given a ticking off. He was told this was inappropriate behavior for a bomber. By the time the Vulcan entered service with the RAF in 1956, Tony Blackman was joining Avro as a test pilot. He, like Falk, once huge bomber it may have been, but the cockpit is surprisingly cramped. As well as 2 pilots in the front, the back had to fit in a navigator radar, navigator plotter, and electronics officer.
It's amazing to be back. Nothing's changed. Just slightly harder, perhaps, climbing up the steps. I used to do it a bit quicker. And of course, the flight deck is so small. A large aircraft with a minute flight deck with a stick, and it was just like a fighter, really.
The Vulcan served in the RAF for an impressive 28 years, even flying missions in the Falklands War in 1982. But there's now only one in the world that still flies, and it's based at Doncaster Airport. It's an important day for XH558. She's going to do a special flypast over a gathering of former V-bomber crews.
When you taxi out, of course, the power is very low and there's not very much noise. and you don't really appreciate what a powerful machine you're handling. It all seems so tame. And then, of course, when you open up the power, it takes a little time for the engines to accelerate. And if you open up to full power on the brakes and then let go, it's absolutely fantastic, the acceleration rate.
The power in the 301 engines was so enormous because you had 4 engines, 20,000 pound static thrust each, and the Vulcan dry only weighed just over 100,000 pounds, so that's why the Vulcan would go. You get this tremendous kick up the backside, I suppose, like driving a racing car.
Vulcan, you clear manoeuvre.
Beautiful airborne, the Vulcan triggers vivid memories for those who spent long hours on the flight deck.
It was a typical Avro aircraft. It was black inside and had the Avro smell of a mixture of hydraulic fluid, fuel and vomit.
And those engines have a sound that anyone who's ever heard a Vulcan before instantly recognizes.
Yeah.
Quite well there, couldn't you? We reckon he was about 800 feet, I think. Yeah. We call happy days, I suppose. Happy days. Really.
Nostalgic.
Nostalgic, yeah.
Nostalgic.
But these bomber crews had a deadly serious job. Anthony Wright flew all the V-bombers. He spent most of the 1960s practicing for nuclear war with the Soviet Union.
I was 21 when I first was responsible for my nuclear weapon in my aircraft. It was a Cold War. They were against us, we were against them, and if they were going to hurt us, then I'd do the same to them.
Practice missions with dummy bomb drops were carried out over areas of mainland Britain that replicated Soviet territory.
So if you went on a mission east, you'd go high, first of all, and then you go down below the Russian-Polish radar, go in and drop your nuclear weapon, and come back. And that was it, really.
We always felt that the massive destruction that could be dealt by the V-bombers would have been so colossal that no one in their right minds would even think about attacking this country.
I'm very proud to have flown the V-bombers. And my father was in bombing command during the war, and he was only too pleased to bomb Germany, same as I had no problem whatsoever to bomb Russia if I had to.
The V-bombers were emblematic of the brilliance, but also the extravagance of the British aircraft industry in the 1950s.
The big problem was there wasn't enough funding to pay for all these.
As well as all the bombers, there was now an almost bewildering array of fighters in or about to come into service with both the RAF and Navy. Gloucester was building Javelins. Hawkers had Hunters and Seahawks. De Havilland made Vampires, Venoms and Sea Vixens. And Supermarine had their Scimitars and Swifts. And even more potential new aircraft were already in development.
The government of the day, when they looked at the requirements for the next 20 years, concluded that you just couldn't afford to operate so many different types.
Something had to go, and the government was ready to bite the bullet.
In 1957, Duncan Sandys, who was then the Conservative Defence Minister, unleashed his white paper for the future of defence.
Sands was a great believer, and had been since the war, in guided missiles and rocketry. And what he really wanted to do was to do away with aircraft and just have guided missiles.
Missiles, not fighters, were supposedly going to be the future. Which meant that the once sacrosanct RAF would be first on the chopping block.
At a stroke, 14 day fighter squadrons and about 8 night fighter squadrons had been disbanded virtually overnight. A savage reduction in capability.
Aircraft companies were told they would have to merge. Within 3 years, most of the multitude had been rationalised down to just 2.